First, I'll introduce these distinguished people. We have just 20 minutes and then a few minutes for questions. I'll go quickly and I won't let them introduce themselves. So Rob Eleveld created the Transparency Coalition, which focuses on AI, specifically generative AI and transparency and governance. He's a super expert on this. He knows everything. He has thought about all the bad things. He's still an optimist. He believes there's a good outcome here. So a very good representative of citizens and consumers, which is the angle we are taking. And Mary Snapp is a vice president at Microsoft of strategic initiatives, and when you strategic AI initiatives. And when you have such a title, you do really secret things. So Mary knows a lot of stuff what Microsoft is doing, and Microsoft is maybe the main AI vendor today. So she has a very strong insight into how a vendor looks at it and how they make sure that both the businesses and consumers they serve are well served. And then we have Joseph Williams, who is an advisor to the governor here in Washington, and therefore represents the people and the regulation part of how we should deal with AI. So I'll sit down here. I'll start with you, Rob. You can go first with a simple question. Do we need at all government regulation around AI? And if so, like what are your thoughts on that?
Sure, thank you, Mårten. Thanks for letting me be here. I may be somewhat of an expert, but not anything like what Mårten said. Short answer is yes. I'm a co-founder of Transparency Coalition. We believe that there should be regulation and guardrails around AI. We think that it can be done without tamping down on innovation. Two very quick analogies. One is if you look at the lack of regulation and guardrails around social media over 15 years, and I won't go through the litany, but we'll end with 41 attorneys general in this country suing Meta, and for repeated lack of protection of children and teens. That's sort of the exclamation point on a 5-year fact pattern with at least Meta that's really awful without any government regulation. So, and we believe that AI and generative AI is moving more quickly and touches more people, given so much more connectivity than there was at the start of social media. So we really believe there needs to be regulation. The other thing I'll mention is the National Institute of Standards has a glossary of trustworthy AI, and it defines transparency as a property of any system to imply openness and accountability. And if you look at the very sort of front runners in AI, starting with OpenAI, we haven't seen any openness and accountability, honestly. And so that's really what we're about.
If I
okay, Mary, you now represent the vendor here.
Well,
how do you look at this?
Surprisingly, I agree with Rob on most of what he said, except for the issue about accountability. Because last week, we actually introduced and launched our one-year report on accountability in our AI, responsible AI systems. You can find it on our website. So we actually think accountability is the most important piece. I will say, just to go just slightly deeper, if you think about how the technology is created, there are the applications, which are a lot of the social media platforms. And a lot of the regulation that exists today should be applied to that. No question about it in those models that use, those services that use artificial intelligence. The large language models, which you talked a lot about, and those as well, need some guardrails to ensure that they are developed in a way that we can ensure as much safety and security as possible. The data centers themselves, I don't know if it's hard to actually get into a data center. It's super top secret. But I have never had more security going through a data center than any place, the Pentagon. You know, it doesn't even come close to going into a data center. And both the physical perimeter and the internals of that really need to be safe and secure, and we need to have standards to ensure that with data centers now all over the world that really can apply on an international basis.
Joseph, so on regulation, you represent the state level, but there could be a local level, a national level, an international level. Could you a little bit comment on AI regulation and on what level of government you think it is needed?
So I think it's important to note that the EU's already passed the AI law, and we're all trying to figure out what that actually means. That's one. And so that's a multi-country collective. State of Washington, what we've done is this legislature just passed the AI task force bill. The Attorney General sponsored the legislation through Senator Wynn, and the governor signed the bill. They're now staffing what that is. I have no idea what they're going to do. I mean, right now they're going to look at the balance between the commercial interests and the public interest, if you will. To your point, to Rob's point earlier about guardrails, companies need guardrails for two reasons. One, they need some insular environment so they don't get sued all the time for everything, right? They don't want strict liability. There's all kinds of legal things they want to be released from or get relief from if there's guardrails in place that are recognized or imposed by a regulatory regime. That's one thing. But the other side is we don't know how people feel about this yet. This is a big unknown. We know that bias is a bad thing. We know that hallucination is a bad thing. But I mean, how does an ordinary citizen, how are they impacted by AI? How can they be negatively impacted? And then what kind of recourse should they have if they are negatively impacted? We don't know yet. So it's very early days. The precursor was privacy. So CPRA gave us an appetite or a taste for how this is going to work. CPRA had a lot of problems. It was written by lawyers. And when engineers had to go actually implement compliance schemes, it was a nightmare. I did 2 major Fortune 50 implementations of privacy, and the right to be forgotten actually is really hard. It's a technical challenge. I mean, imagine Microsoft. They know a lot about you, but they don't even know everything that they know about you. Finding it and purging it is really hard, as it turns out. So we don't know what's going to happen on the AI side either.
Can we go, Joseph, a little bit deeper on consumers? Because like Rob said, in the past 10 years, all the burden has been on consumers. Nobody has really protected them well. Like as a consumer, you must watch out for everything yourself. Do you think with AI that we can get to a point where, as a consumer, you don't have to know everything and read everything and study everything? You're just a happy user and you can trust the vendors and the regulation. We start with Joseph and then we let Mary.
I'll just say, starting in the 90s, people started talking about AI is going to give you personal assistance and subject matter expertise, and through augmented reality, you're just going to be better than you've ever been able to be because you scale better. Right now, I only scale across me, and sometimes my wife helps me out. But that's it. But with AI, potentially, I could be running dozens of agents that just work for me at very low cost or no cost at all. And so I think there's a big upside to what's going to happen for the consumer, but what am I giving up? What's the price I'm paying to do that? Who owns my data? These are big problems that have not been resolved legally or in a regulatory regime yet.
Well, I will start by saying we believe that the customer owns their data, full stop. And that is really a value that we started 5, 6, 7 years ago thinking about privacy and security. We already are seeing a lot of customer benefit from AI. I use Microsoft Teams, and if I come to a meeting late, I can ask Teams to summarize what I missed. I use it to summarize email. I'll tell you the most recent, just a little out there. But tonight we're having a neighborhood meeting because there is a proposed nude beach that is going to be officially recognized in the neighborhood. And we have
Was that a hallucination or
no,
real?
Believe it or not, it was very discreet, but now it's going to be quite public apparently, and anyway. So we're having a community meeting tonight, lots of email, and I asked Microsoft Outlook to summarize the email for me.
Yeah.
It did a pretty ding-dang good job.
But will you go as far as Microsoft to add a button where you say, please fact-check your own answer?
It's there.
You do that?
Yeah, it's there.
Okay.
It's there. It's on Bing, and it's on the Outlook as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And will there then be the accountability that Rob mentioned, that if you have given the wrong answer, there's some sort of
now, that's an interesting question because the large language models really, as Rob knows and Jim knows too, they learn by more and more data. And so, just saying you just have to check things, and it's going to get better and better and better.
Yeah.
So, we're very clear that, you really should use this as a tool, and it doesn't replace your brain.
Rob, what do you think about consumers? Like, do they have to learn all this stuff? Do they have to know what an LLM is?
Well, I think they need their government entities that are elected by them to look out for them. And just a simple example of this is private information. And private information is much bigger than 10 years ago. We talked about private information as PII, name, address, phone, email. That is a tiny sliver of private information today. So consumers are under the impression that their healthcare data is protected by HIPAA. Well, HIPAA only applies to hospitals and insurance companies. So Google knows everywhere you've been on your maps, okay? And so does Facebook, basically based on where you've posted, checked in, or so forth. If you went to a mental health clinic, if you went to an abortion clinic, if you went to receive a treatment for cancer, that is absolutely part of private information and is being sucked into large language models today, and consumers don't know it. And so I don't think that those companies have any track record of protecting consumers. They are about data for targeting advertising. And and consumers don't know it's happening because it's happening on massive scale and a huge amount of data about them. And so I think their elected representatives need to look out for them.
So do you mean concretely that you go to Congress and ask them to pass laws that would forbid that sort of usage? Or how would you concretely fix it?
Well, I mean,
if you had the power?
Mary said that consumers should own their data. They should own that data. They don't even know it exists, most of them.
Right.
And so there needs to be some transparency there, hence our name.
Yeah.
But private information is probably our number one concern. And again, PII is this tiny little sliver of it. Of what's going into large language models. There's 17 states that have privacy laws now. I can tell you, without question, those privacy laws are being run over roughshod by OpenAI's just sucking everything in.
Do you think that there's sort of a reasonable defense or excuse if they say, okay, but we are anonymizing it, or we are not using the individual, we're only using it in the aggregate?
I think there's plenty of stories out there of figuring out very specifically who someone is with people that are familiar with chatbots, and I think your team has probably seen more than you want to share of it.
We've seen a lot.
But you have customer
But
contracts.
I want your opinion. I want your solution, because you have seen...
I think a solution
is
a federal law, and we have
Right.
not been able to pass in the United States a federal privacy law that applies across the nation in 20 years.
Yeah.
And that's
A federal
really,
law
really
is
necessary.
super important, and there needs to be accountability with it.
Okay.
You bet.
That's for privacy. But how about impersonation? Like now, many of us may get a phone call from somebody we think we know, and it's actually an AI bot. Do you stop that with regulation? How do you stop that?
Both. You need to stop that with engineering, and you need to do as much as you can to quickly identify, to let the person know it's happened, and depending on what the issue is, to be transparent about it. So that's both. And so engineering is important, but you have to have enforcement for the activity, or otherwise it will just continue. It's a cat and mouse game with the engineering and the bad guys. The good guys and the bad guys, as you know. I mean, you really know.
In any technology.
In any technology. It's a cat and mouse game. So engineering plays a role, government plays a role, and I know you think that consumers, have been put upon, but there really is a literacy element here that's going to be important too. Sort of a digital literacy element that's going to be important to continue, unfortunately.
So Joseph, now here they spoke about federal law and international EU. What can a state do, state of Washington? Are you making sure that this state is better than all the rest, has better protections for consumers? Would you have an example of how that's done?
Well, so in the absence of federal law,
Right.
the states need to act. In terms of AI, the state doesn't yet have a perspective on how AI should be regulated. It did have a perspective on privacy. We're in the process of studying it. But in the absence of federal law, we will act eventually. We'll probably pay attention to what California and New York do. They tend to be our touchstones. We'll also pay attention to what's happening in Europe. Actually, when I'm in London for their show, I'm going to be visiting their regulators to see what they're doing for AI regulation, and I've already met with the EU people. So the idea is we'd like to have a global standard. It's not going to really be easy because China and Russia aren't going to play ball, or Iran, countries like that. But in the absence of that, maybe some sort of NATO, EU, Western approach to that. But to the point I think that Mary brought up, I'm sorry, but if I'm sitting in Libya and I do an impersonation, how does regulation prevent that?
I agree. It's super hard. It's just super hard.
It is.
And there, we have international regulations in all kinds of areas, and we have, nation states who don't, comply. But does that mean we don't do anything? Or, you have to act, I think.
You get this, it's kind of the TSA moment where there's the illusion of security. So, and that could be helpful, but honestly,
I'm
think
glad the governor has such an honest and authentic advisor as you.
How many of you flew here today? Oh.
But now we have just a couple of minutes left before questions and answers, and I promised we would end on an up note. So let's now focus on good examples. Like Mary, you get to brag first. Like give some concrete example of how Microsoft or OpenAI or some other vendor has taken a concrete action on their own to make it safer and more trustworthy.
Yeah. Well, we called it an Office of Responsible AI in 2019 after we had, committees of the highest level executives in the company thinking about AI uses. That committee is about 25 or so people. They're a combination of PhDs, lawyers, engineers, anthropologists. They work with 400 engineers around the company who analyze every single instance in which we are using artificial intelligence in our products. When they identify what we call a sensitive use, we can go into that, but I know we don't have time. A sensitive use, psychological injury, individual, changing your rights, like voting or something like that, or in fundamental rights, or something like bias in a certain way. It comes back to this team, and it undergoes a very iterative manual and engineering process called red teaming, which I'm guessing you all already know about, where you literally, as you said in your speech, you try to break it, you try to break it, you try to break it, you identify, you measure, you mitigate before it's released. Is it foolproof? No, but we do that. And again, I'd actually love to have a couple of you take a look at the transparency report. It's 50 pages. It's pretty detailed about the work we do, and we're committed to releasing that in the coming years and years and years.
Wonderful, thank you. Rob, now what good examples have you accomplished or seen?
One of your customers you mentioned up there was Hugging Face.
Right,
the Stanford Center for Human AI, Human-Centered AI, has published a transparency index. Much broader. Our focus is transparency on training data, full stop. Their transparency index has 15 elements, I think, of which our focus covers maybe 2 of those 15. Anyway, Hugging Face ranks the highest on that transparency index, which there needs to be, I think we all know if you don't measure something, nothing improves. And so we're a believer in an index like the Stanford Center for Human-Centered AI put out as a benchmark or a measurement, and we think that's important. We do believe that there's higher leverage on transparency around training data specifically. We got an amendment in the task force bill specifically around training data. We're supporting a training data bill. I testified in front of the California State Assembly a couple of weeks ago. So we are focused on training data, but transparency broadly, per Mary's point, we think it's very important.
Wonderful. Joseph, you get the last word. Mention something some positive development in trustworthy AI?
So one of the amazing outcomes is the Washington State Supreme Court asked the Practice of Law Board, of which I sat at the time, about whether impoverished people with no accessibility to legal advice would be better served by having AI advisors, and whether the state would recognize the legal status of that. And a very positive report came out of that. So the idea of having AI-informed legal advice for people who cannot otherwise get it is a significant development in a very positive way.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we have a few minutes for questions, and will somebody help me with that, or how will it work? Yes, here's Brega with the microphone. There's a question over here in the front line. And quick questions, only one question per person. Don't try to sneak into.
I'm Justin, I introduced myself before. So thank you all for being here. I think AI is of interest. I'm specifically interested in protecting content creators. And that comes in from the large language model, the data collection. And I think it's mission critical for a conference like this, because we have these innovators that come up with a basic concept and then they try to improve it. And if that's hoovered up by an AI harvester or what have you, and becomes part of a large language model, they're no longer able to monetize and profit from their invention. And there's been a lot of, writers, for example, I think the European Writers Association of some sort has had a letter to this effect. So maybe from the large language model or data collection to create the models, what's happening to protect the content creators? I don't like that word, but the creatives that are doing things of interest. How is that affecting them? Meaning, how can we protect that content so they can actually use it for their own good and for their families?
Sure. Maybe a question for Rob.
Yeah, I can answer a little bit too, but go ahead.
One of our, besides private information, the other focus of Transparency Coalition is around training data is protecting IP and copyright. There's no other industry that doesn't license IP. There's tomes of books at the University of Washington Law School about licensing IP and copyright. We're big believers in that. The short answer is no one's protecting anybody right now. I can tell you straight up, and just specifically, OpenAI just deleted 2 of their what's called Books 1 and Books 2, and it was unearthed as part of the due diligence in the Writers Guild lawsuit against them that they destroyed this data. Why? They wanted to hide something.
I guess I would say, you didn't say, I used to be a lawyer, forever and ever and ever at Microsoft, so I knew a little bit about copyright back in the day. It is true that the copyright law today does not extend to the technology that we have. And so there will be, I hope there will be, some amendments to laws going forward. That process often goes a little slowly. And so I do think there should be some commitments by companies enabling people, and it's not a great solution because it's manual and it puts the burden on the owner to opt out of training. So using their data for training models. So that's an interim solution, but I do think copyright law it's going to have to be reformed. But let's.
A long time.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next question. We have one there? Yes.
Yeah, hi, Johan Strand. So being a naive Swede, but just in terms of the process of creating laws in this country and just given the political landscape, it's kind of unfortunate that we have very important laws that needs to be made, but there's a big divide. So how do you see that changing up? It has to go through Congress, but the Congress is a little interesting. So just in terms of how do you actually see this process going forward?
We're spending a fair bit of time in talking to various staffers in DC. And I do believe that is sort of dysfunctional at the very high level and, on social media. The Congress it seems that AI is one of two issues. They're really focused on finding some bipartisan agreement, so there is some hope there. I have seen in both, we've primarily focused on state legislative bodies, but both at the state and the federal level, I do believe there's a tacit inherent understanding that there was a huge miss in social media, and that we can't sit on our hands and hope it goes well, because that just did not work in social media. So we've got to put get some regulations and guardrails in place. They're not going to be perfect. They'll need to be iterated on, just like the technology itself is iterating. But I think there is at least some hope that despite some of the partisanship on many issues, this may be a bipartisan issue.
I agree with you. But I would also say that there is a huge range of knowledge about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And so it will be absolutely important for Microsoft and other companies to really spend time, knowing that we don't make the laws, but spend time just telling people what we're doing with the technology. I mean, I talked with a congressman yesterday who his first question was, should we regulate it or not? And I don't think I shouldn't even have said, that person didn't really even understand differences between general AI and chat. And I mean, so there's just a lot to learn as we regulate.
Yeah, one of our two missions is just educating policymakers, full stop, because we believe that AI is a system. I'm an engineer. It's got inputs and outputs like any system. It needs to be thought of in a simple context, not a super complex context. Of course, there's many, many outputs, and that makes things complex if you think too hard about it. But at a high level, we are focused on educating policymakers, because we think if it's going to touch all aspects of society, policymakers need education.
And with that, thank you. Thanks to the panel, amazing panel here. Joseph, Mary, Rob, thank you very much.
Good job.
Thank you.